My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, it's a crowning achievement with a sting in the tail, as we look at Empire in Flames, Part 2.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. Empire in Flames is the final volume of the Enemy Within campaign for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st Edition. It was first published in 1989 by Games Workshop. We are reviewing the 151-page PDF published by Cubicle 7 in 2018. The design is by Carl Sargent. The concept is by Jim Bambra, Graham Davis, Phil Gallagher, and Derek Norton. The editing is by Mike Brunton. The cover art is by John Blanche. Maps and handouts are by Charles Elliott and H. The internal art is by Tony Ackland, Paul Bonner, Gary Chalk, Colin Howard, Martin McKenna, Russ Nicholson, Adrian Smith, Steve Tappan, and Bill Thornhill. Our parade of men are back.
Hey. On to the contents. Add a very mandatory spoiler warning here. If you're currently or soon playing the Enemy Within campaign for the first time, you definitely want to avoid listening from about now, because Part 1 was spoilerific, Part 2 is even more so, if that were possible. So let's summarise the adventure as a whole, and this is the blurb. The Empire is a troubled land, a country almost on the brink of civil war. The Emperor is weak, internal dissent is growing, and chaos is an ever more powerful threat. In the midst of all this, the player characters are summoned to Altdorf, but arrive only to hear news of the Emperor's assassination. As subsequent events prove, the Emperor's nephew and heir is not an ideal candidate for the throne. He too is killed, and in the ensuing confusion, the PCs are given a momentous task. They must find the one artifact that can reunite the Empire. Their quest is nothing less than following in Sigmar Heldenhammer's footsteps, the founder of the Empire, and recovering his legendary hammer. It is a mission which will decide the fate of Sigmar's empire. The PCs must travel deep into perilous wastelands, pursued by religious bigots from the Empire, and beset on all sides by the servants of chaos. In the World Edge Mountains, they must discover a way into the remains of the dwarf stronghold of Kadar Khalizad, and drive out its new goblin occupants. Beneath the hold, the PCs must face the unquiet dead of the dwarfs and summon enough courage to take Gal Maraz, Sigmar's hammer, from its resting place. Possession of the hammer gives them the chance to prevent full-scale civil war and to unify the Empire under a new emperor. But there is one last danger to be faced and defeated, one which could undo all that the PCs have done, even in their moment of victory. All very epic, but in this episode we will be discussing just the second half or so, which is the dungeon section and the return to the Empire. So that's from page 57-ish. We covered the journey to the World's Edge Mountains in our Part 1 episode in September 2021.
Let's talk about how we have used this module. I, of course, as last time, have just read it. What about you, Tom?
I ran this over 15 two-hour sessions using Woofrup First Edition, as Sigmar intended. I also, many years ago, played several sessions of this sort of back end of the adventure, but it was about 30 years ago, and I don't remember much about it, so mostly GM'd it.
Before we dive into things that we liked about the second half of Empire in Flames, I do want to take a moment to note and memorialize the fact that we are at the end of our coverage of the Enemy Within campaign, Tom. We have, essentially over the course of the entire history of the show, have been covering each module gradually, sometimes in two parts, and we are finally at the end. I am so thankful to be at the end of the Enemy Within campaign coverage, but also I'm thankful that we got to do this together. It's a treat and a joy.
It's been quite the journey, hasn't it? It does. I think we might be the first podcast to pull this off as well, much like...
I think so,
I think a lot of Warhammer campaigns never made it this far. As far as I know, we're the trailblazers in this respect, and it's almost as big an achievement as actually playing all the way through it, I think, isn't it? So, yeah, good job.
I'll count that for me.
Yeah.
That works. Let's talk about things we liked. I'm going to start by just saying that obviously everything I said last time about the presentation applies here also, but I want to particularly call out the 3 dungeon maps. They are wonderfully detailed, very functional. They have this really nice hand-drawn quality of art that is a pleasure to look at. Like, I just sort of found myself poring over these maps and wishing that maps were like this more.
Yeah, they really draw you in, don't they? They're so atmospheric, and I think I mentioned this in the part 1 episode, but they inspired me to spend more money on Roll20 just so I could get the fog of war setting, that I could allow the players in this online game to have control of their own players and just sort of wander around the map and explore it for themselves, so they could have this not exactly the same view that I was getting, of course, because I wanted them to bump up against locked doors or walls and not be able to go through them. But I remember looking at these maps and thinking, I can't really do this I can't really show them the map because it's a GM's only one. I have full confidence in my ability to describe dungeons, but I really wanted them to be able to poke around these rooms. They look a bit creepy. They look like the kind of rock-hewn subterranean labyrinths they're meant to be, and that worked really, really well, actually, just letting them poke around. And also a trick I did, so this is kind of an aside, it's a little online games only technique, but what I did was I would leave the monster tokens on the map so that when someone was doodling around, moving their little figure and getting updates, they'd sort of see at the edge of the torchlight, oh, there's a shape. What's that? Oh no, it's something scary. Quick, everybody come over here.
Right.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Because, you mentioned there's 3 maps, and it's quite well divided into 3 sort of tones. So there's the goblins bit, which I guess we'll talk about a bit more in a second, which is mostly a fairly straightforward action dungeon, you could call it. But then everything past that is quite creepy and spooky and bone-chilling. And so that freedom to wander around and get yourself into trouble in the dark was particularly good online.
That's a good segue into talking about the dungeon more specifically. So the dungeon, Kadar Kalazad, Dwarven Stronghold, classic dungeon environment. I think at a high level, it's just okay.
It's basically very boring as an overall concept. Oh, there's a goblin dungeon. Oh, amazing, yeah.
At a high level, it's just kind of okay. Yeah. I do think it gets better, much better, in fact, if you sort of dig down into the details of the dungeon. I think this applies to the entire Enemy Within campaign. I've only read it, to be fair, but just at a sort of high level, it's guys going down a river, right? And like getting caught up in like tax issues sometimes, and occasionally and there's just like sort of like political thing going in the background. It's not like bad, but at a high level it just feels like, I don't want to say tropey or like,
well, it doesn't even feel tropey, does it?
That's not what it is.
It just sounds
boring.
Rubbish.
Yeah. It sounds boring. Yeah. But it's not. It's the details that make it kind of interesting. We've said that over and over again as we've covered this campaign. It's the people, it's the characters, it's the very, almost like the minutia of what's going on in the various towns and things. And we get a little bit of that feeling with the dungeon too. Now, obviously, civics are not emphasis in the dungeon like they are in the rest of the campaign. But I will say that the Goblin Warren, for example, on paper, that sounds like the most boring dungeon level. It's a bunch of goblins. But when you sort of like get into it, I think what makes it special is that the goblins themselves are quite distinct from one another. This is not just a homogeneous horde of goblins. They're very distinct from one another. They have personalities. They're all like quite wretched and disgusting on the whole, but the author is clearly reveling in that wretchedness, which I think is really enjoyable. I was a little bit reminded of when I first watched the movie Gremlins 2 as a child and being amused by the fact that there were all these different types of gremlins, It's like, oh, there's a spider gremlin, there's a TV show host gremlin, there's an electricity gremlin, right? Like, I had a kind of a similar feeling reading all these goblins because the goblins are like a little different. Like, I think there's even a spider goblin, like one strapped to a spider.
Yeah, and it's funny until you mentioned this, I hadn't remembered that actually in play, those goblins, they played really well to the group. Like, everyone enjoyed fighting these goblins because they had that dynamic. Not just let's all line up and fight the heroes, but like one goblin is dashing over here to protect a particular other goblin. Mm-hmm. They could see, even before they got the story out of anyone, that stuff was going on, that there were like the goblins had different objectives from each other. At least one person said, "I love this guy," when they found out the name of the main chief goblin, and he started kind of mouthing off at them. It was a good time. It was an actually good goblin fighting time, which is a rarity, I would say.
Yeah,
so,
I think so. They have personality. They have like different things they're each doing. We even get like a sort of version of the ridiculous moral quandary of murdering goblinoid babies or whatever. Like we get all this, right?
Yeah,
like this dungeon kind of
I think
has
they
like all
just
that,
closed
right?
the door on that one and moved on. Yeah,
Right, yeah. It felt like the right kind of dungeon level for this campaign. This is my only exposure to Warhammer anything, so I actually don't know like how applicable this is to all of Warhammer. But in much the same way that like the towns, what made them interesting was the fact that they felt like a lived-in place. They felt like a real place. This is a similar kind of thing. This Goblin Warren feels like a real ecology, and it's the individuality of the goblins that makes it. I also want to note the quote-unquote wizard goblin has the name of Rat Scroat Bog Gobbler, which is amazing. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, 10 out of 10 on that one.
Absolutely.
I think I would say the next levels are less characterful. They're a little bit overworked, maybe, but your players will only encounter a bit of that. Our group just pretty much tried to be as efficient as possible. You know, they were like, we're here for the hammer. Don't engage with the rest of the dungeon. For example, without going into too much detail, I would say I feel like there's a bit of redundancy in the undead level. Like there's a couple of subplots and you probably don't need to bother with all of them. But as long as you hit one and a bit of another one, then you're good. And then you should be focusing on finding that hammer. And then in the location where the hammer actually is, there's loads of weird stuff going on, and ancient dwarvish sorcery, or rather protective wards and chaos stuff. It has that good sense of escalation from outside world to goblins, which are weird but basically normal, and then the undead, and then the freaky chaos stuff underneath. So yeah, it's good.
I didn't pick up on that in the read, but that makes sense thinking back on it. Like I can see that escalation of tone and vibe and aesthetic makes a lot of sense to me. I just want to go back to for a moment this idea of the dungeon feeling like an ecology, like a proper ecology. I found it really interesting that there was an instance where the treasure of the level, the big treasure, was not found in the place you would expect the treasure to be. Like you would expect the treasure to be at the end of the corridor, you know, the last door that you can go into, and there's probably like a bunch of traps or something. But this treasure was in room 45I, which was one of like several little barracks rooms. And I just remember thinking, I love that. Because there's no reason why the cool treasure would have to be in that big, bad trap room, right? It can just be tucked away wherever the last person who had it put it. I just thought it kind of spoke to a level of, I don't know if realism is the right word, but believability, or a kind of believability you don't usually get in a dungeon environment that I appreciated.
Yeah. It's a sort of a slight sense of bathos as well, which is very Warhammer, which is, it's good. Let's segue from bathos to absolutely insane, overpowered mega fantasy, because the next thing that I like, I mean, quite apart from the finding Sigmar's hammer, which
seems like a big deal,
is the equivalent of finding the Holy Grail in an Arthurian game, and you're just kind of doing it. Actually, I almost don't really want to go into the whole dungeon thing, like, because, you know, if you want to play this scenario, you'll do the dungeon, and it's like, I don't think it's the most memorable part of this, although you get good incidents out of it, but it's not the keystone. The keystone for me is freaking meeting Sigmar. After Hammer Go the Mad, an avatar of Sigmar shows up. By the time you're 5 books deep into a game of Warhammer, like, this is an incredibly big deal. Like, even if you didn't care about Warhammer when you started this thing, you absolutely care by now. And, you know, that actually, I think, we talked about the achievement of podcasting about this. The real thing to like about Empire in Flames is the sense of achievement, because you've done so much to get here. Even if you skipped something rotten in Kislev, you've done a lot. And just having an aim out of character and achieving it is a good thing. In this case, when I played it, our aim was, we're going to play all of The Enemy Within. We're going to take the first edition Warhammer from the 80s. We're going to play it all the way through. You can set other goals, and having goals that you, I think crucially, might not meet. You could still have a good time, but not pull off the goal. It wouldn't be that bad. But then actually doing it, that's what's so great about this scenario. And freaking meeting Sigmar, that's kind of, you could end the game there, and you'd be like, do you know what? fine, we're done.
I thought it was going to end there. I was surprised when it kept going, actually.
Yeah.
With that little moment where they meet Sigmar and he makes his little speech, and now there's a new king. I thought that was like the end. Like, I thought that there was not going to be any more.
No, and
I was
and
like,
to be
wow,
honest,
there's like 50 more pages.
Like, it almost feels like, oh, this is going to be a bit not so good, but it does kind of recover. It does find a good way to have another climax after that.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right.
Multiple endings is a thing, especially when you've spent so much time on a thing. It's like a celebration almost. I get it. Like, I totally get that. Video games do it all the time. I think what you're kind of saying, and now we're sort of leaving the dungeon and definitely getting into the other part of this part that we're covering. Last time we talked about how the criticism of Empire in Flames tends to be the linearity. It really kind of is a railroad in a lot of ways, right? Like, there is a thing to do and you're going to go do it. But what we talked about last time, and I think it's just punctuated really well here, is this idea that this is the payoff. Like you just said, it's the payoff. Like, this is the reward. And it's kind of okay that the whole module is a reward, right? Like, the whole adventure is like just the reward for doing this. You want to go get Sigmar's hammer. You want to have that moment. I don't even know much about Warhammer, but when I was reading that part where Sigmar, the avatar of Sigmar, shows up, I could just feel on the page that this was important. It felt like really important. I was like, this is a big moment. And so I think that this is another thing I like about the module is it's pretty transparent about its goals, which are to just be a big time payoff for people who love Warhammer, who love the world, who love the setting, and who have put this kind of time in. And I think it's good for that reason. At least I think that's a good aspect of it for sure. I think it probably comes off a lot different if you've played it rather than read it, though. We'll say that.
Yeah.
If I were just reading it and not having these regular conversations with you who've played it, I would probably come away with a lot of the similar conclusions that the critics of Empire in Flames have, which is it is very linear and a little contrived, right? It's just going to feel a little
it's a
contrived.
Bit of a parade of, hey, look, it's the next thing. Yeah.
I would probably feel that way too, but I think because I've gotten this sort of perspective from you about like what it's like to run the campaign, I was able to receive Empire in Flames in the way that I think it's meant to be received, the way you would receive it if you actually had played the whole thing.
Yeah, it's by no means perfect. And in fact, the next part, after you've met Sigmar's avatar, is one of the least perfect bits, which is you then have to head back with the hammer to return it to the rightful heir, which through various means you figure out is a character from a previous adventure, which is the son of the leader of Middenheim. And there's a bit in here that is massively always criticised, which is you go back to the elf town and they offer you some Pegasi to fly back most of the way. Now, these are absolutely not cool, I have to say. It's like one of the weird things about Warhammer, of course, is it's grim and gritty on one hand, but you've also got high elves doing sorcery. And freaking Pegasus are not cool.
Yeah, the Pegasus scene is definitely the silliest
It's so
part of this.
dumb, and to be honest, I would have skipped it, except the thing is, and I will say that it redeems itself if the players are the ones that suggest it. Like, if you're the one that has to go, hey, would you like these flying horses as the GM? Maybe skip it, let them walk back.
Right,
but if someone goes, wait, didn't the elves have some flying horses? Then by all means, go for it. Also, the Pegasi don't really like the player characters, which I find quite funny. They kind of dump them off at the end of the journey and refuse to go any further.
They'll take one step further. They're like,
exactly,
no,
because you've had your big awe-inspiring Sigmar moment. Now you're back in the Blackadder of the Adventurer sequences, and at that point you go into these.
It's kind of funny.
Yeah, it's kind of funny.
And Warhammer's kind of funny.
Yeah,
I think it's fine.
Because that's the thing, and then you get these sort of bleak vignettes to follow. So you need a little bit of a transition from epic to a bit funny, and then back into the mud and blood kind of stage, I think.
Yeah. I think I've pretty well covered what I want to say about things I liked. I have a couple of extra notes here, but I'm going to save it for the expert delve. Anything else you want to talk about?
Yeah, I do want to talk a bit about the journey back to Altdorf, the capital. Well, so actually, rather, what happens in the plot is the hammer is leading you towards where it's supposed to be, and that turns out to be at this battle, kind of halfway between where you are and the capital of the Empire. You get these quite good grim and gritty battlefield or near the battlefield scenes, which I like, especially the Looters of the Dead scene where the PCs have to kind of confront these guys who are scavenging the corpses of their own side's dead is particularly good. And there's a whole bunch of vignettes. I think if you try to run all of them, don't think that would be great, but you just sort of use whichever ones you feel are right, and then it works nicely.
Or do it in montage, right?
Yeah, exactly. Do a little montage and then do kind of go into depth on the ones that pick up. And then during the battle, you do get to revisit the best character from Power Behind the Throne, which is
Prunkball.
Siegfried Prunkball. That was great because, again, the character recognition, I didn't even have to say his name. I just had him do... I did a little voice for him in a sort of Alan Partridge style. Just had him go, "Ah!" and shout across the double. Oh my goodness, is that him? And it was Siegfried Prunkball. And spoiler alert, he gets himself stupidly killed, as you would expect. But it was really good. Really good to see.
There's a line, I don't have it in my notes, regrettably, but there's a line in there where they talk about how Prunkball is looking for a knight who's as true and brave and equal to him, but he's having no luck so far. Like, it's just a great let's paraphrase, but it's pretty epic.
Yeah, so he's good. And then to address the climax, actually, the second coronation, well, it turns out someone else is also a kind of chaos demon guy, and it's just grimly inevitable, and yet it still works. Like, it's sort of it's not surprising. It's a I knew this would happen moment.
Mm-hmm.
But then you get this tremendous climactic fight scene. Your PCs in the Warhammer, you have a number of fate points, which are get out of jail free cards, will save you from certain death, but you tend to only have about one or two of them hovering around at a time. By the time you get to that scene, we were on, I would say, 2 people on 0 fate points, a couple on 1 each, and those are pretty easy to get rid of when you have a gigantic chaos demon in the fight scene. So at that point, it gets really good because, and I think we'll talk about this more in the Expert Delve, but the PCs get to genuinely be brave. They're like, I've got no fate points left now. If I die, that's it. I'm gone. But I'm still, well, maybe I'll run away. Maybe I'll actually try and save some lives. And whichever one they choose, that's a good and interesting outcome, right? It's a genuine in-character thing. And also, it's full heavy metal chaos fighting.
Right, yeah.
We had a bit of that in Something Rotten in Kislev. And especially since one of the PCs in that adventure had become a chaos champion of a renegade god. We had so heavy metal chaos on both sides. We've talked a bit before about how published Warhammer adventures tend to focus on the mud and common people side of things. But also there is that kind of Slayer soundtrack, battling in the rain kind of stuff that you really want to do. And you get a chance to do it here, which is great.
I love it. So let's go on to questions we had about the module. This may not have even come up in your game, to be honest, but I'm just really curious about it. There's this one part of I believe it's the dungeon, it's the dungeon, where the characters are facing this earth elemental, and you're given this like block of how the PCs might be able to deal with this earth elemental. I'm going to just read it real quickly. A zone of sanctuary spell will prevent the elemental from attacking the PCs. It will simply turn its attentions to undoing their hard work by overturning the pews, for example. If the PCs wish to help Kana, they will have to deal with this dangerous and unpleasant creature. The PCs do have one small advantage. Using the name of Grungni in any direct orders to the elemental will cause it to freeze in terror for 1 round. For example, in the name of Grungni be gone, or by Grungni stop. It will not move under any circumstances if held by Grungni's name. It will not even defend itself when attacked. What I could not sort out, and this is a problem I have with OSR games in general and old school games in general, is how do the players figure that out in the moment? Are they meant to know this? How did your characters do this?
Okay. Simple answer, I don't know. I don't think it's possible. But actually, they are in a dwarf hold. So, like, if you have background knowledge, Grungni is the main god of the dwarfs. He's the only one that shows up in the main Warhammer rulebook. So you could, like, guess, if this is a guardian elemental, maybe it's worth doing this. But my issue with this, though, is even if you do that, that is a heck of a gamble. Like, I'm going to forego my action for this round to just hope that this works. Yeah, as written, I don't think it works. I think you would need to, I don't know, at least let them have a kind of discern realities role to figure this out, right?
Yeah.
Like, but,
I know how this would be handled in games I run. I'm not sure how it goes in like these more traditional games. Like, how are the players even supposed to know this? I don't know. Anyway, that kind of thing.
Honestly, I don't think that happens. In the game we played, they sort of poked their head into that temple bit and didn't really stick around, so it didn't come up. But
Fair enough.
No good.
What's your question?
My question is, why are there not more NPC callbacks? Okay, we get Siegfried Prunkvoll, we get
the
the
most
Togbringers.
important one's in there, though, right?
Yeah, I mean that's true. I mean, if you're going to get one, it's that guy. But there are so many cool characters from before, earlier in The Enemy Within, and I brought in as many as I could, like Dr. Malthusius, the enthusiastic fairground guy from the first adventure with the three-legged goblin, and brought in the cockroach organ-playing man from Death
the beetle
on the
guy,
Range. I mean, he's not meant to survive the adventure, but, come on. And the players kind of introduced, when they got to Outdorf, they were like, or on the way, they were looking people up that they knew. But really, this feels like such a missed opportunity, A
little bit,
so many you could have.
And the funny thing is I think the reintroduction of Prunkvoll actually confirms that the authors at least understand the power of this. They at least get it.
Yeah.
They just chose to just do Prunkvoll and basically no one else at the end.
Tragic.
But you can do it yourself, like you said. You can adjust it and make it happen in your own game. Let's go to the Chain Lightning round. Speaking of those Pegasi, the Pegasi arrive in the elves' village early on the following morning. The elves carefully saddle them with lightweight training harnesses of the sort used to train young elves. There is some good-natured laughter from the elves. The idea of great strapping adventurers being tied to flying horses like children amuses them.
When you find the final chamber in the lowest level of the dungeon, and hanging in midair some 6 feet off the ground, directly in front of the crater, is a 2-handed warhammer. This is the object of the PC's quest. Gal Maraz, Skull Splitter, the hammer of Sigmar Heldenhammer. All they need to do is reach up and pick the hammer out of the air.
There is a stalactite chamber in the dungeon. It reads, "This chamber has a profusion of stalactites hanging from the ceiling. Twisted dwarven faces with expressions of infinite sadness can be seen deep within many of the stalactites. Most have their mouths open in silent screams."
Upon the PC's return to where Yodri, the ancient dwarf sage, had met them after the dungeon. With such horrific injuries, Yodri must be dead. Yet, as the PCs approach, he moans slightly and opens his eyes. A single croaking thought, half heard, half felt, comes from Yodri. Not bad for humans.
And finally, on the map of the Vauxhall, showing the people who have turned up for the coronation, the illustrator has drawn in a little symbol for every person in attendance, and there are hundreds of them. It's a surprisingly effective way of making it feel like a special moment via the map. It wouldn't have been nearly as good if it had been just a basic layout of the room. Let's go to the expert delve. Our topic for today is grand finales, wrapping up your campaign, big final encounters, the end. And I think we have a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, we do.
We're going to hit on some things I think that we've talked about in the show before, but that's okay. I want to start by saying that I've been thinking about this in comparison to video games because I have been playing a lot of video games lately and playing and finishing a lot of video games, which is something I tend to do around the holidays. I've been reminded in recent weeks that even extremely good video games frequently have really bad final encounter sequences. They don't always break the game, but they definitely leave a bit of a stain on the experience. For example, I just finished The Last of Us Part 2. Spoilers for The Last of Us Part 2. Excellent game. I love it. It's probably one of the most satisfying video games I've played in ages. But the final encounter where the two main protagonists, who you play both of them at different times, they face off against each other in a ridiculous fist fight. It's a janky, poorly constructed fist fight. Like, it's so awful. And it just feels like a complete anticlimactic letdown. Like, it feels like the absolute worst way to have this final encounter. It would have been so much better if they had just encountered each other in a cutscene and had a dramatic moment. But we have to do this weird janky fist fight. Video games fall into this trap. I've been sort of obsessed with it and trying to figure out why is this the case? And if I can figure out why this is the case, maybe I can take some lessons from that and maybe help apply it to role-playing games, or what I think role-playing games have the power to do better. That's my personal framework for thinking about this topic today. I don't know how you feel about it.
I think that's a great framework because actually I think about video game endings. They are frequently not good, and the ones that are do have something in common with good RPG endings. And actually, wait, let's do a quick caveat here. We are talking about kind of grand finale, so specifically kind of the going out like a goddamn hero ending.
Mm-hmm.
Other types of endings are available, like the wistful ending, the cliffhanger. I mean, I'm a big fan of a sort of quite slow or tailing off ending, but that's not what we're talking about here.
We're talking about big, heroic, final boss encounter.
Yeah.
Big hero moments.
Or sometimes those can be like emotional grand finales as well. And actually, I think the stakes, you're so right to pick out the stakes. Like if I think of Life is Strange has some janky endings, but what's great about them is there's no difficulty. You're just choosing one of two things.
Right.
But what makes it hard is because both of those options are of value to you.
Well, let's go back for a bit.
Yeah.
This video game thing. What I've sort of identified, like why these grand finales of video games frequently suck. There's several reasons, and sometimes it's a combination of these reasons. But for one, sometimes the final bosses are often arbitrarily difficult. Mm-hmm. They're just like really hard, and they're just like really hard in a way that like they're dramatically harder than what came before, and that just feels a little weird. But probably even more treacherous here is the fact that it doesn't even really feel like there are stakes sometimes, because in my Last of Us Part 2 fist fight that I mentioned, you just do this fist fight. You probably do it like a dozen times before you finally do it correctly. And each time you just like hit continue and do it again.
Each time is less dramatic.
Right, yeah. And so each time you do it, you know you're going to eventually do it. But there's just, you know what the outcome is going to be. But you just have to like keep doing it again. So just the momentum is sapped. And you don't even really feel like you're accomplishing anything. You're just like, who cares?
Yeah, just kind of, yeah.
And then also, you frequently, in these like sort of final sequences, you frequently have to engage in gameplay that is unique to the final sequence or the boss and does not use the skills you've been developing over the course of the game. This is probably the biggest sin in my opinion. I do think there's some lessons for role-playing games here. So maybe we could talk about those lessons now.
Yeah, so I think the key lesson from this one that you've identified here is that the reason that you can keep pressing continue is because the designers know there is only one quote-unquote interesting outcome. And what role-playing games are good at and frequently fail at is they don't have more than one interesting outcome. So Empire in Flames does this kind of pretty well. Even if the player characters lose to the big demon at the end, they can have saved a whole bunch of lives, or they could escape, or they could be the heroes, right? Whatever happens, something interesting is the outcome. So the trick is to think, if you're the GM or even the players, to be honest, consider how the various possibilities that are coming up, how they can be framed to be a satisfying conclusion, while avoiding the thing that I think also infects a kind of D&D 5 play culture, much like video games, which is the issue of like everyone knows the GM advice is to fake the tension and then let the players win, right? Yeah. There's no real stakes because we know, maybe one of us will die and it will be tragic and someone gets to do a bit. But there's no real belief that we could quote unquote lose or that there could be any real divergence in the outcomes. And that's that's pressing continue, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, there should be stakes. I'm a big believer in that you can do a lot with tension, even tension that's doesn't really lead to any negative outcomes. It's just tension for tension's sake. I'm totally into that. For the grand finale, though, I think the stakes need to be real. I think the possibility of failure needs to be there. And there are several reasons why, but the biggest one is just that this is the power of the medium, as you've alluded to. You can't just press continue and try again in a role-playing game. If you all die at the end, well, I guess that kind of sucks for whatever, whatever you were trying to accomplish, but it's still a really cool outcome, right? Especially if you go out in a blaze of glory. And like you have in your notes here, you might still accomplish something good and heroic. You might still accomplish something, even though your characters are dead. It's the power of the medium versus, say, a book or a video game or a movie, which have foregone conclusions, to have multiple possibilities. There are different things that can happen, and I think you should lean into it. And leaning into it means making the stakes real. And so to me, say you're fighting the big chaos demon boss at the end, it's less important to me that the boss is hard than it is that the stakes are real. If you have a 70% chance of beating the boss just on the numbers, but that 30% outcome leads to something really game-changing in the setting or catastrophic, then it's still really satisfying, even if you were likely going to win, because we know that 30%, which is still significant, chance of failure could lead to something really drastic and catastrophic. The stakes are the important thing.
Yeah. I mean, I've mentioned why I like 1 in 6 as the deciding stuff probability in role-playing games. It's the Russian roulette probability.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to win on a 2+ when you roll 1d6, that seems pretty sensible. That's fine. But if the 1 means that the gun goes off against your head, everything is ruined.
Yeah.
That's tense. Like you say, it doesn't matter what the odds are. I've been that player who's rolled the 00 on a percentile dice and completely screwed up. Every so often it's going to happen. And especially if you've loaded something, it's exciting, yeah.
It's
especially
exciting,
if you load lots of things onto it. Like we mentioned Siegfried Prunkvold. Sadly, I mean, I don't think his cameo is not quite as climactic as maybe we're talking about here. But if you've loaded it up with sort of how things are different or the same since, you began the adventure, now things are different. You met these people on the way, now they're on your side. You met these other people on the way and upset them, now they're against you. If you array those things as well, that's really powerful too and can help to at least set the scene, if not kind of influence mechanically things that are going on as well.
Even if the player characters do have a 70-80% chance of success, regardless, just on the dice, on the numbers, the fact that they could fail makes the victory sweeter. The fact that there are real stakes makes it sweeter. And so I think setting appropriate stakes, making sure they're real stakes, is probably a really important point here, irrespective of how hard the boss is. That's not to say a very hard final boss encounter can't be fun. It absolutely can be. I very fondly recall some sort of ancient red dragon encounters back in my D&D youth, those very, very hard fights where it's just like a slog of attrition. And that's something some groups get into. Nowadays I don't really do that. That's not my thing anymore. But back then I loved it. And it was fun to take down a dragon that has like 400 hit points, right? Like that's a lot of fun. That can be fun. But I think what we're talking about is something maybe a little bit more nuanced. It's the power of narrative as opposed to numbers. But regardless, the stakes have to be real and interesting, regardless of how hard the final encounter is. Oh, we'll say, I have a couple of notes here about like if you are going to have a super hard grand finale, like a very tough encounter.
Oh yeah, go on, yeah.
You should probably telegraph this. It should not come out of nowhere. Avoiding our video game problem of it's just the difficulty ramps up dramatically. I'm reminded of the very end of the first Uncharted game. The first Uncharted game clips along at this like really particular manageable difficulty level until you get to the very final boss fight, which is hard as fuck. And it's so dramatic. It's like such a huge spike in difficulty and you're just like, what is going on? So if you're going to have a really hard fight, if you're going to have that ancient red dragon at the end, make sure you telegraph it either through stories or rumors. Just make it feel like it's something that is going to happen so the players are not feeling cheated, essentially, right? And feeling like it's a part of the story. It feels a little congruent with the story. I also think it's interesting in a really tough boss fight if there had been or is some kind of magic item or similar thing to help you face off against the final boss. Whether or not the players get a hold of that thing is not as important as them just knowing about it. And sometimes it's even better. It's even better if they know it's a thing, they knew about it, and they didn't do it.
Yeah, like because there was something they had to do that was too difficult, so they didn't bother, and then, that's good. Yeah.
So they're kind of like made their own bed at the end in that case. But anyway, a couple little bonus notes there on like tough final boss encounters.
I'd like to go back, though, to what you mentioned about divergence from the skills you've learned in the game. You're right, this is a thing that happens a lot in video games. The good example of this, though, is Portal, maybe Portal 2, maybe both of them, where the whole game spends time teaching you how to make
teaching the whole thing. Mm-hmm.
Teleport things and how to do this and that, and then at the end of it, and I remember genuinely the first time I played it, doing the final level, thinking, oh my goodness, I'm stringing together all these things that I learned how to do. This is great. What's the TTRPG equivalent of that, would you say?
Great question, yeah. This is the part I've been really thinking hard about since I decided to use video game final finales as my framework for thinking about this. I don't think it's so much a matter of gameplay. I don't think the context is about... I don't in the role-playing game context, the congruency, using the skills or the things we've been doing in the past to make it match up to the end, I don't think it really has to do with the gameplay. Because honestly, if you think about it, no one's going to make like a brand new subsystem for fighting a boss in a role-playing game, right? That's not going to happen. You're dealing with the same rule set the whole time, unless you're playing Burning Wheel or something, right? Where like that modular approach to game design is a thing. But most of us aren't doing that. The sort of role-playing game equivalent to this is the reincorporation of key narrative elements. NPCs, themes, motifs, bits of lore. That stuff is how you are using the things that the players have learned and done at the end. And we've been kind of hinting at it already. So this is what reincorporation does. Reincorporation is like a big, big note here. This is your chance to take the prunkvols, take the accordion playing beetle guy, just all that, or harpsichord, or whatever the hell he played. But taking these characters and putting them in at the end. If there's a major theme, making that theme sing in the final encounter. If there's a particular visual motif, in my game The Between, it's the color sapphire. If there's a particular bit of like lore that figures prominently, having that bit of lore come out at the end. Empire in Flames does this with all the Sigmar stuff, right? I think that's the way you do this earned experience at the table at the end.
Yeah, that's right. Although this isn't in my notes, but this has also made me think of one of the best finales I had to a quite low-key game, which is a Vampire the Masquerade mini campaign I ran many years ago, back when Vampire the Masquerade was a thing. And the plot was essentially the player characters have to escape from London with people, the rest of the vampires hunting them. Early on in session one of the players had decided that his character was going to try and get hold of a flashbang grenade for reasons that weren't entirely clear to me. And I don't think I did this consciously, but by just sort of going, yeah, sure, whatever, you could probably arrange that. What I was doing there was allowing early on the seeds of emergence at the finale.
Yes.
So like the mistakes I could have made were to say, no, that's really difficult, and made it into a whole thing. Another mistake I could have made would have been like around session 3 or 4, presenting some kind of golden opportunity to use it. But instead what I did was I just kind of let it hang, and I think he'd mentioned in session 2, oh yeah, he collected it and he had it in his backpack.
Yeah.
But it was like right at the end, they're at a motorway service station, South Mims for London residents paying attention, trying to get away. And at this one crucial moment, someone remembers he has it in his backpack. And
it's great.
It was this crucial one thing.
Yeah.
I think you can allow yourself to, as I did by mistake in this case, but I think if you do it deliberately, let little things kind of float around from the beginning and don't worry about them. Like leave them hanging, because they may well come back. Because I imagine there's like probably about a dozen similar things that happened with the whole group in that first session that I now don't remember years later because they never came to fruition. But that doesn't matter, because the one that actually happened,
that's the one that sticks.
Is the one that sticks. So yeah.
In previous episodes of this program, I have used the term the Rockstar GM, the Rockstar GM moment. And the Rockstar GM moment is when you take something that was mentioned early in the campaign or earlier in the campaign, and then you reincorporate it into a later session. I call it the Rockstar GM moment because it's the kind of thing that players absolutely go gaga for. They love it, and it makes you look really, really cool. Like you really have your shit together as a GM, right?
In fact, what's actually happened is you finally remembered what that one note you wrote 3 weeks ago means. Yeah.
But I will say here, though, that this grand finale, this is your last chance in the campaign to have that Rockstar GM moment, and it can indeed be the biggest of the Rockstar GM moments. Like you said with the flashbangs, there's always this like one thing, at least one thing, frequently more than one thing, but there's always this one thing that the group talks about wanting to revisit, whether that be during debrief or between sessions, just small talk or whatever. There's always like this one thing, and it might be the thing that you as the GM keep forgetting about, or it might be the thing as the GM that you just haven't been able to find the right place for that thing to come back into the story. But the grand finale is your last chance to do it. Now, I don't think you should force it. I mean, because that could just come off as hokey. But if you can find a way of making that dangling plot line, that thread, that thing that the players have plainly expressed an interest in seeing again, make that come back into the grand finale, you're gold. Imagine, for example, that a player mentions having a missing sister early in the campaign. That's partly what they're trying to do. This actually happened in one of my games. And for whatever reason, you keep forgetting to do something with this sister character, right? Or the opportunity never comes up. They always come back to it. Well, I wonder what's going on with your character's sister. That's the kind of thing that it could be a real wow moment if you make the sister figure into the final sequence.
It almost doesn't matter what you do with that sister character in the final episode if she shows up,
If she's connected to the big bad in some way, if she's been pulling the strings in the background in some way, it's a holy shit moment, and players will love it. They'll love you for it. Like, that's a good thing to do. Even if the rest of everything you've done as flying off the rails in this grand finale, you could do something like that and just totally pull it right back as far as like feeling good about what you accomplished as a GM.
Yeah.
Some other little notes here. I think you should definitely try to leave some room for ambiguity where needed. The temptation as you're wrapping up a campaign will always be to tie things up neatly, but you don't have to. You can leave some things open.
The classic movie writing advice is enter the scene late, get out early, and I think you should do that with grand finales as much as is reasonable.
Yeah.
Like the extreme version is like the end of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Spoilers for Butch and Sundance coming up, but basically as they charge out against insurmountable odds where they're almost certainly going to die, that's it. You never see what happens to them. I was in a game where that happened. We were preparing for our final stand against the unsurmountable forces, and I just went, should we just leave it here? And we all kind of looked at each other and went, okay, let's do that. I think that works better in a one-shot than a campaign, but one-shots can also have grand finales. Yeah. But equally, I would say you have to let everyone answer the things that they really, I would say really want to, but maybe really need to. And I think sometimes as a group, you can sort of judge each other and like which bits really need to be answered and which could be just left. And the more you can leave, I think the better.
It's going back to power of the medium too. When The Sopranos famously ended with their cut to black at the very end, and you have no idea if Tony Soprano got shot or not. Late spoilers for Sopranos. Late spoiler.
Although, is it a spoiler because you don't actually?
No. Yeah. Well, there's really not. No, right. So the thing is like you as the viewer, unless you're like going to go write fanfic or something, you don't really have the ability to find out what happened to Tony Soprano post Fade to Black. However, in a role-playing game context, you can leave some ambiguity there, and maybe next year you pick up the campaign again and you continue the story and you flesh those details out. You figure it out. Power of the medium. Why not? We also both have notes about epilogues here.
Yeah, see, that being said, yes, I do love an epilogue. And I think this goes with the getting out early, because you can do your bang, there's the scene, done, go. Yep. But you still let everyone fulfill things by doing epilogues. The technique I always use, because it works really well, he said modestly, is I will kind of go to player one. I'll say, what's your character doing a week after this happened? To the next one, I'll say, what about a month later for your character? Then a year, and then 10 years. And normally when you get to 10 years, people go, 10 years, wow, let me think about this for a while. But that I think is great, because it means people aren't competing on their answers. They also get to fill in the gaps they want to fill in.
Right.
I've also found, I don't know if you've experienced this, Jason, but a surprisingly high number of players I notice in the year and 10 years category choose quite sad epilogues for their characters, I don't know, what's your experience with epilogues?
I'm a trophy GM, and the answer is yes.
Forget it. Yes.
That is what players do, because that's the kind of stories we like to do in Trophy. I agree. I think epilogues are great. I think what's great about the epilogue is, to some degree, the grand finale is the GM having their moment. In a lot of ways, it's a moment that belongs to the GM, because it's the GM saying, here's all the badass characters, here's this badass final boss encounter, this is the big heavy metal grand finale, look what I've done, isn't it amazing? And the epilogues are kind of like the player's chance to tie things up with a bow, right? And I think that's why epilogues are important. Everyone gets to have their moment, everyone gets to have their closure, and I think they're super, super important, and I'm surprised how few tables do it. And I know this because I always have brand new people I play with who always tell me like, oh, I've never done an epilogue at the end of a session before, which blows my mind, but okay, I'll keep preaching it. Like, please do epilogues.
It's so easy for the GM, because all you have to do is say, let's do epilogues.
I mean, and almost like necessarily the players get the ending they want. Obviously, you have to frame it up in a certain way. So in Trophy Dark, going to the leave it hanging ending, final encounter thing, and then do an epilogue, I end Trophy Dark that way a lot, where they get to ring 5 and it's like this terrible, horrible monstrosity. The stakes are super pregnant. Everything's really, really pulsing with possibility, and the characters are probably already like at 6 ruin. They're done for. And then I just cut, and then we go to epilogues. And it's great because you get the ambiguity plus you get the closure. It's a great 1-2 combo. But anyway, so epilogues are great. If we could sort of summarize our advice here, the grand finale, I think the key is just to make it feel connected to the rest of the campaign, no matter how you have to do that, whether it be the reincorporation of themes and ideas or plot elements or NPCs or what have you. You got to make that connection feel real. You got to make the stakes feel real. And you can't pull the rug out from under the players either. That's important too.
Yeah.
It has to flow up to that moment.
Yeah, and any sacrifices they make have to be things they could willingly choose to do, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Look for opportunities to show a blaze of glory. If they're all going to die, let them die gloriously. Why don't we go ahead and move on to the next segment? It's companion adventures. We don't have very many today.
Not really. Please see part 1. Yeah.
Exactly. Like part 1 is where we kind of really did this, listeners. All of my things from part 1 apply here. I do have just some further notes, really, about the expert delve. So why don't you go ahead with yours?
All right. I just got a couple of film notes. I think I may have mentioned this before. I'm going to say 2006's Alla Triste for the battle scenes, because it's that kind of muddy Renaissance era warfare. My other film recommendation is Carrie from 1976, perhaps the most famous depiction in cinema of someone at a coronation ceremony turning out to have unexpected chaos attributes. Now, that on one level that is a joke, but on the other that is also... I was sitting around thinking there's actually... Weddings being interrupted is sort of thought of as a trope.
Please make this work. I'm dying to hear this.
But there's actually not that many. You've got The Graduate, The Princess Bride. It's not as big a cliche as you think. Whereas actually, if you look at the prom in Carrie and you compare it to the coronation scene at the end of Empire in Flames, that switch from everything is happy and tranquil and dreamlike to mass hysteria, I think that's probably pretty much how it goes. So, yeah.
Fair enough. For companion adventures, I want to talk about sort of an addendum to the last conversation during the expert delve, which is sometimes the best way to have a great finale is to prepare for it before you start, right?
Yes.
I would like to recommend any of a number of Powered by the Apocalypse games, especially if you have not really played them before. You can pull this one particular sort of GM campaign management tool from any of those games and use them in whatever game you're running, because it's pretty system agnostic, which is called the front. And most games it's called the front. And what the front is it's... In some games, it's like a worksheet or it's like a handout. In other games, it's just advice for how to organize your notes. But essentially what it is it's a way for you to track at a high level characters, moments, things that might be happening in the future of the campaign, things to follow up on. It's just a way of tracking all that information. And I find that it's probably the most helpful tool when you are getting ready to plan the final sessions of your campaign. You go back to your front and you look at your front, and that's where you can pull those things that you have wanted to go back to, those things you've wanted to reincorporate, those things you've wanted to look at. For the fantasy context, I think Dungeon Worlds is particularly good, and I think that's worth looking at. But even the sort of where they all started with Apocalypse World, totally worth looking at. You know, I've said this before, but so much of Apocalypse World and Powered by the Apocalypse is just good GMing habits and techniques codified. And so you can take a lot of these tools and use them, and they work just fine. And the GM fronts is one of those things, or MC fronts, I guess. I will say that my own game, The Between, actually really specifically focuses on this final encounter idea. You're given a literal worksheet where you basically track the progress of the big bad, and you make notes periodically about what the big bad might be up to. You jot down characters that the players like. You jot down enemies that become recurring enemies, and this other information, all in the lead up to the final encounter. And you can take that format and adapt it to your game very easily. So that's my recommendation for companion
that's
adventures.
great. It's a bit surprising in a way, but I don't think anything except PBTA really has the game tech to compete with that, you know. So
really
Between sounds great, especially for the final encounter, because like I recently finished running Apocalypse World, and you know the front sheet is amazing for all the reincorporation, but the difference is there. Halfway through the final session, I still had a whole bunch of different possibilities in play for that final sequence. So it wasn't really narrowing down things until we got there.
Yeah, the Betweens method is
much
much more structured and focused, and meant to funnel you into that final encounter. Yeah. So it's particularly salient for this conversation, I think.
Excellent.
Well, listeners, that is our show. That is the end of our coverage of the Enemy Within campaign from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition. If you've enjoyed it, you can find out more by following The Gauntlet. The Gauntlet is at GauntletRPG on Twitter. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. If you would like to support our show, it's Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Jason, thank you. Thank you also to our newly crowned Imperial Editor, Rich Rogers, and thank you, listeners, for joining us on this long.
I hope he's not a chaos demon.
Journey. Well, fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
Listeners, we want to let you know that Hearts of Wulin, our PBTA game of wuxia melodrama, is now available as a PDF on DriveThruRPG. Hearts of Wulin emulates films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and Shadow, and TV series like The Untamed and Ancient Detective. It is inspired by the Chinese martial arts novels of Jin Yong and Gu Long and their many adaptations. In these tales, romance is as dangerous as a blade. You can buy Hearts of Wulin at the Gauntlet store on DriveThruRPG. You can find more information and resources for it on our Gauntlet blog, on the Gauntlet webpage at gauntlet-rpg.com.